Hello, webinar world. I'm Lisa Austin, and I am speaking to you from Edinburgh University's Doucette Hall, right next to the Bruce Gallery. I am here to welcome you to the Mini SX, and it's a one-day event. And I just want to tell you a bit about SculptureX itself, which is a teaching and networking platform that was founded in 2010 to catalyze collaborations among teaching institutions and art institutions. Originally, we were just focused on Western Pennsylvania, where I'm located, and Ohio, but it has spread to include a number of institutions. And we've had different symposia in Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Bowling Green, and Toledo. And I'm happy to report that next year we will be having a face-to-face event in Greensburg and Pittsburgh from September 16th to 18th. And you'll be able to find all of that online at SculptureX.org. Today we have three different panels and presentations. There's one right now at 11. It's the emerging artists. At 1 p.m. it'll be the three artist educators, and at 3 p.m. there'll be a conversation organized by Dr. Paula Burley from Allegheny College. Right now, the institutions that are directly involved include Allegheny, Chatham, Edinburgh, Seton Hill, Slippery Rock, University of Pittsburgh, and also the Sculpture Center in Cleveland, which is the sort of fiscal center, and the Artist Collaborative Civitas in Erie. So with that, I am going to turn this panel over to Melanie Lancetto.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for this Mini SX 5 Emerging Artist presentations. My name is Melanie Lancetto. I'm joining you today from Lexington, Kentucky. I'm an artist currently pursuing an MFA here at the University of Kentucky, and I received my BA from Chatham University in Pittsburgh. Last year, I participated in SculptureX 2020 Art and Agency Symposium as an emerging artist myself, which was a great way to engage with other artists in the early stages of our careers and during a time, especially now, when networking and these communal opportunities are a little bit difficult to access. So following the symposium last year, I volunteered to organize the emerging artist portion of this event, along with some other presenters from last year, Ella Medicus, Caitlin Sweetland, Sage Baxter, and Riley Brown. So Riley also took care of our social media, helped organize the call, and brought on 3 wonderful additional jurors from his emerging artist community in Toronto to participate with us. Those individuals are Akash Imbakumar, Philip Ocampo, and Megan Faley. Together, we worked as a team of jurors to select this group of 5 speakers from a pool of very talented artists to share with you today and their practice. So these speakers include Noelle Choi, BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University, currently pursuing an MFA at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Violet Mainborg, currently pursuing a BFA at Cleveland Institute of Art. Simon Tatum, a BA from University of Missouri, currently pursuing an MFA at Kent State University. Shori Sims, currently pursuing a BFA at Carnegie Mellon University. And Dennis Doyle, a BA and BS from University of Pittsburgh, currently pursuing an MFA at the University of Colorado Boulder. So each of these artists today is going to be giving a 6-minute, 20-slide presentation of their work. Between each presentation, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'll select some questions so if you do have questions, which we highly encourage you to participate and engage with these artists today. If you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A tab, as the chat tab can be used for the audience and our presenters to kind of like have a dialogue and, chat. So it's open throughout the presentation for comments and discussions for all participants. The Zoom webinar will be recorded for future viewing purposes, and we encourage audience members to reach out to artists and continue their dialogue initiated by these presentations. So contact information for these artists can be found probably in their presentations and as well on the SculptureX website. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Noelle.
Let's share. Okay, play. All right, hi everyone, I'm Noelle. I'm gonna be talking about a handful of projects from the past few years, up until like yesterday. Here is my dog touching a bunch of cash from her last birthday party before she died. My lava lamp I'm in love with, and my studio window, and my family. So Lady died when she was 17 and a half, and I took her ashes on tour across the country to all the places we'd lived, plus fictional heavens. It was a portable karaoke ceremony that fit into a suitcase, and I had a record player, and I brought the Spinners record with me. There were programs and a confetti cannon, and I went to 9 locations. So the previous picture was from Joshua Tree. This one is from my roof that was at my apartment in Brooklyn. Because there was a joke that she didn't go to heaven, she went to burger heaven. So the final location was the burger restaurant in Manhattan, and the staff on the right let me throw this party after they closed. The final version was a compilation of footage, just friends saying things about her. It was such a like collaborative, loving project, and I visited so many friends and kind of just spent the summer singing about how much I loved my dog who died. The trip was funded by about 45 of my friends and family, and it was based on this really chaotic reward system I made. So I had these thank you packages, and these were some things that were in it. I made a cast of her last poo, and then there were like vegetable backpack holders as modeled here by one of my friends. And I was really on this karaoke kick. So I was given the opportunity to have a show at a friend's gallery. So I thought about not trying to recontextualize it so much as just exaggerate it and like explode it. So I was into this shared concept of this language and like just having a party. And my friend and I, we built this grassy hill that you had to climb in order to sing. And then they painted the entire gallery with like a fictional audience. The title is like 27 A's, like the alphabet. And it's kind of like karaoke across time and genre. It was pretty simple. I was interested in the mythology of the water dragon saving people from a flood and like this imaginary savior. I'm 3rd generation, and so I like just read about this myth online. And so my mom recited a recipe while I pretended to follow it. And I was interested in the artifice, which kind of came into this other piece, which was this dragon performance where I tried to do a pull-up and slide out of its mouth. And the pull-up bars were bananas. So I was interested in like how this dragon in this myth was actually functioning. After my mom passed away, I was thinking about the role the dragon played, and if the dragon was my mother or if it was me, and how this idea was reflexive. So this was on the tongue of the dragon. I was into the idea of like sliding down her arms after this feat. So I wasn't sure. It was kind of this weird thing where it was like kind of really funny, but also really sad. This is the back of it. The platform is tiled and there's some glitter in the grout. There was a red carpet that I let down as the tongue that I slid down. So there's a couple detail shots of that. As you can see, there were chairs that I made. And as part of the performance, I had to drag these rocks one at a time back to the platform as I was stepping on this like really long silver cape that I made. And the audio was a transcription of Toby Robbins' Personal Power that was set to like the actual music. And the chairs that I made were really not very supportive. So the cup holders of the chairs had this note in them, and everyone's invitation said crisis or body. And you put the note over your invitation that you brought. That was like, this chair can't support your crisis or body. So this was a shirt I made for my mom's birthday. I sewed the stripes together because I couldn't find a fabric to match the one in the picture. But so the shirt's on the left, and then there's a scrap of the test print, and then a final photo of me wearing it is on the right. And that's still in my studio. And this piece, I actually just finished it yesterday. It's really fresh out of the oven. I was thinking about Kristeva's concepts of true individualism occurring after your mother's gone, and self-sufficiency and constancy. The flower, it was like a flower tower, and there's a center of water. Like you're supposed to water the center of it and it feeds itself, but the flowers are made of ceramic. So all the water instead is concentrated on the top in this. Is this gonna play? Let's see. Okay. So there's like a detachment there, and like the dinosaurs are super mythologized creatures as the only water source. So they're having a disco party in the top of the piece, which is really fun. So there's just a lot of facade. There's ionic columns holding that part of it up. Let's see. I think it plays again. Okay. These are raccoon glasses. These were just a really fun thing that I made. Like when your makeup runs and then you have raccoon eyes. So I always thought it'd be funny to just have raccoons over your eyes instead. And I put flames on them because they're stylish. So I made this spaghetti hat out of spaghetti. It says bad. And I guess, so I think I want to put something in here because I like to have fun in the studio. And I've been thinking a lot lately about making like cheesy moves in the studio, but intentionally and critically. And I think there's a sweet spot in this overlap with grief and trauma, especially intergenerationally. So I think that a huge part of my practice with that same concept is like like I make a lot of postcards and I send them to people. So this is like part of a collaboration, a couple of them on here with my friend right now. Some of them were like thank you cards that I sent to people who like help me fund projects. So a big part of my practice is really just staying in touch with people because I think there's something in being able to confide in someone, and that's very much a collaboration to me. So like you can find on my website the compilation video from the final tour, or more the thank you presents that I gave out to people. Because I like sending people things, so that'd be really cool to connect, and I'm really earnest about that. I think that that's a really big part of why I like having conversations about my work, because that's really exciting for me. All right, I think that's all. So thank you for listening to all of the information. That was a lot of information really quickly.
Great.
I'm gonna stop sharing now.
If anyone has questions for Noelle, if you could drop those in the Q&A. We have about 2 minutes for Q&A now, or 2.5 minutes. And then if you have more questions for Noelle, okay, so we've got one question. Noelle, can you talk more about how tragedy translates into celebration in your work?
Well, I think that I think a lot about how like grief and trauma, there's a lot of humor in it. And I think that in the same way that not in art making, there's a lot of defense mechanism in that. And I think that's also a place where like things can be funny too, and how trying to work through things, because that's a lot of how I think I process things personally. Because it gets really absurd and unpredictable. So I think that translates materially and with a lot of concepts that I think I work with specifically and throughout like different projects too.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question. Your art is so deeply personal. Are you ever worried about relating to people different than you?
Well, I think there's still there's a lot in the nostalgia of the things that I talk about that I think is still pretty universal. And I think that that's where a lot of the heart comes from, is that I'm really passionate and excited about the things that I'm working on. So, I mean, I think there's always gonna be disconnect when you approach a work of art that you don't know a lot about the art maker, because so much of that goes into work on a really private level. But I don't know. I think it's just fun to make things that are important to you, but be able to talk about them and have things that other people can be excited about too. But I think that's what's so fun about talking about your work with other people.
Great. Okay. There's one comment from Ella, one of our jurors in the chat about getting on your mailing list. So maybe Noelle, you can address that in the chat, and maybe other people can also see. Yeah. So we've got one more question for you, and then we're gonna move on to our next panelist. So,
Okay.
even though Lady is in burger heaven, will she continue to influence your future work?
Oh, I think that she'll always continue, like, influence my future work. I think I'm actually going to start working on pet portraits today for this installation. So I'm going to, yeah, I think that I really try to hold on to people and animals that have a really big impact in the way that I work, because I think that those like stay with you. So yes.
Great. Thank you, Noelle. If you wouldn't mind stop sharing your screen, and then
Yeah.
we can move on to Violet Mainberg. And Violet, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Go ahead and share. All right. I hope that is viewable. Hi, my name is Violet Mainborg. I am a senior at Cleveland Institute of Art in the Sculpture and Expanded Media department. I've been doing art for my whole life, pretty much. In 2013, I attended Pratt Institute. I was really into making music videos and short films and all that, documentaries. But I really wanted to be more hands-on. I missed building things. I would always build things as a kid. So I really missed that hands-on stuff, like building props for music videos. So I went to Cleveland Institute of Art, and this was one of my first projects at Cleveland Institute of Art. It's a terrarium guitar. It's kind of futuristic. I learned how to use a wood shop, use electric saws my first year, which was incredible. I'd never used like a miter saw or anything. So this was one of my projects sophomore year. I learned how to use the lathe and how to 3D model and 3D print. And I made this ray gun little prop thing. This was a project I made junior year or sophomore year, and it really gave me a chance to learn and love how to make molds. I fell in love with how to make stone molds, and this was an installation I did where I used all these different materials: latex, hot glue, wax, soap, silicone, all that. This was another project I did in sophomore year. It's my first animatronic sculpture. It's a latex blob sheet thing over a mechanism which is made out of wood, which causes the surface to rise and fall, which gives the illusion of a breathing mechanism behind it. So I'm also doing a series of self-portrait works. These were featured at the student exhibition, independent exhibition last year. It really gives me a chance to play with like special effects, makeup, and photography and lighting. It gives me that creative outlet where when I don't want to build something. Here are some more self-portraits. Blue, But Daddy, I Love Him, and personal growth. I recently had But Daddy, I Love Him featured at the Black Box Gallery in Portland, Oregon, which was a really good opportunity for me. Here's some more self-portraits. It's really, really nice to be able to have this cathartic release for my emotional energy. When school isn't in session, you know, it's just a fun little thing I like to do. So here, I really wanted to get into starting a narrative between portraits. So I took all these on 35mm black and white film, and it kind of tells the story of a betrayal, like a married wife and a working husband and all that, and a mistress. So I kind of wanted to incorporate the filmmaking style and photography. This is my senior thesis work.
It's making these silicone monsters to talk about my own experience being transgender in a funny way with these B horror movie monster-ish things. So this is my first one that I created this year. It's made out of silicone resonant wire, and I originally intended for it to be an animatronic robot, which you'll see later on in the presentation. This was my first experience doing something like this ambitious in terms of mold making and airbrushing and painting. So it really gave me some really good experience in trying to find the right tones for flesh and, you know, how to paint the veins and everything. Let's see. So this was the robot I made. It's an animatronic pedestal, which basically all the mechanisms are in the pedestal. I welded the frame and I programmed it myself, where it just does these random movements in kind of like a slow, agonizing manner. Here's some videos of the internal mechanisms of the robot. This was incredibly ambitious for me. There were tons of technical problems and obstacles to overcome, but I was able to be successful. So I'd say that is. This was the second monster that I created. It's about 12 inches tall or 13 inches tall. It sits on the ground, which I was really playing with, kind of like making a monster that was cute and that you could sympathize with. Here's some detail shots of that. I decided not to include eyes just because I wanted it to be kind of like a helpless creature on the ground that you would kind of want to help, like feel around or anything. It kind of has this mutant alien vibe, which I'm excited about in my future work. This was the third creation of last semester. I was playing with life casting hands and fingers and really trying to incorporate more of a humor in my work. I think like this goofy monster is, you know, the perfect representation of me, because I feel like, you know, experiencing the world and being transgender is kind of silly. Like being between two genders is like a silly thing to me. So that's kind of like where the humor comes in across my work. Thank you very much. You can find me website, Instagram. If anybody has any questions, I'm here for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Violet, so much for your presentation. Yeah, so if anyone has some questions for Violet, please post them in the Q&A. We have about 3 minutes for that. And also, if you have questions that you think of later, you can post it in the Q&A during other presentations, and we can address them at the end. Okay, we've got one question from Sarah Paul. How do you balance humor and painful content?
Well, I think the balance of humor and serious content is kind of like a tightrope. You either fall in one direction or another, depending on where you are with the certain serious topics. Like at one point, I'll view these as more serious, and other times I'll view them as more humorous. And I think that kind of serious versus humor comes across with the audience. I think like it's kind of weird to see this kind of like gross, like visceral monster on a pedestal and being like, ew, that's gross, but also like kind of sympathizing with it and laughing at it. And I think that kind of incorporates everything I'm trying to do with my work.
Okay, we've got another question. How do you initially come to animatronic work, or how did you initially come to animatronic work as an exploration of your experience as a transgender person?
Well, I've always been fascinated with robots. My favorite place was the Cleveland Science Museum, just seeing kind of like robotics works. And there was a robotic exhibition, and I was on a robotics team in middle school, and kind of just like I've always been fascinated in kind of automated movement And sometimes it feels like I am a robot in one form or another, kind of just going through some automated processes. So I kind of want to explore that with, in terms of robotics versus humanity, kind of like how they intertwine. So that's kind of where I see myself in my work.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Noel has a question. Noel, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, it didn't work in the Q&A. No, I just had a question about how you draft all of the creatures that you make. Are you rendering them digitally? Is it how it starts? Like, do you sketch it and then render it digitally, or is it just digital and then you create it physically?
No, that's a great question. One I get asked a lot, actually. I don't do any like drawing of them beforehand. I kind of sketch with the clay. I find that kind of just feeling it out and doing what I feel like doing in the moment is kind of the best drafting process I can have. I kind of feel like just like sculpting how I feel is the best way to do it. So.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more questions. So we've got 2 more questions in the chat that I guess we have time to answer. Violet has time to answer. And then if you have more questions for Violet, feel free to ask them and we can address them at the end. So we've got a question from Sierra Weissmiller. Is there a reason why you have the silicone monsters the size that they are? Are you planning to make one that's life size?
Yes. So the size that they are currently, I view them as kind of like my babies and my children. And the size was really important to me because I want them to be able to be like cradled, not by the audience, obviously they're on pedestals, but just kind of like the talking about fertility and all that, kind of like being trans and not being able to have children. I can make children, so that's kind of how I view the size. I want the audience to be sympathetic and not overtaken by the size of it.
Yeah. Okay, we've got last question from Patty Beachley. Do you think your portrait pieces relate to Cindy Sherman's work? Do you see them as deconstructing/reconstructing/exposing gender?
Well, it's funny because I started doing all these portraits and, I had done a lot of them. And then I finally found out who Cindy Sherman was. And I was like, how are we so similar when I have no idea who this is? I think it's a way for me to express my own femininity and, express myself being a woman and trying to kind of like, incorporate this beauty and horror, which I'm kind of doing with all my work. I feel like it's important. And I feel like there's a lot of similarities between me and Cindy Sherman. So definitely.
Cool, great. Thank you, Violet. So why don't, if you would stop sharing and then we can move right on to our next speaker, Simon Tatum.
All right. Can you all see this?
Yeah.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. So as mentioned before, I'm Simon Tatum, and I'm a current candidate in the Sculpture and Expanded Media Department at Kent State University. I also want to mention that I was born and partially raised in a small set of islands in the English-speaking Caribbean, which plays a lot into my work, this idea of moving from different cultures and having cultural exchanges and exploring identity politics. Some of the first projects I did outside of my bachelor's program were these mixed media installations or mixed media sculptures that I was calling my memory tanks. And basically they have arrangements of ceramics and linen flowers placed in water tanks. And the water tanks are framed and shaped to resemble these sort of house graves that are on my home island in Grand Cayman. So I was playing with the sort of folklore and the stories behind these house graves. One of the first projects I started doing when I came to Kent State University were these plaster casts. So I was looking for different items that had certain aesthetic qualities to them, different souvenir items, and then also making handmade items through clay and casting them all in plaster and making my own custom-made souvenirs. And these were my sort of first attempts at them. And as we get further along in the presentation, I'll speak more to these souvenirs. but these were good material studies, so I just wanted to mention them early on. So one of the projects I did in between my bachelor's and my master's program that I think really got me started on my current graduate research was a project I did with a graphic designer and artist based out of Trinidad, Kristen Chen. He has a project space, or I guess a project initiative called Toothprints, where they do different poster installations in various places. Usually it's in Trinidad, but for one installation, he did it at Cayo Grande, which is in Arunjastad, Aruba. And he reached out to different Caribbean artists to make different poster designs. And I was one of the people who participated. And I created a poster design that was an advertisement for my home island in Grand Cayman. And so playing with the sort of dialogue you have of when you're a tourist and you're going from one island to the other, you always see posters and advertisements for a different island. So you're doing this sort of hop around from one island to the other. And this idea of advertisement language played into the works that I made last year for my review show for my master's program. One of those works was my Souvenirs from America. And these are large drawing installations that incorporate vinyl graphics on the wall, and they're also overlaid on top of frame drawings. And so both the compositions on the wall and the compositions of the frame drawings are playing with these different ideas of media I was consuming last year during the summer in the US, and thinking a lot about Black bodies in public space. So when there was different moments happening within the Black Lives Matter movement within the US, I was really thinking about how these major movements were happening in the public realm, but a lot of the things that I was doing to learn more about Black culture in the US were by watching movies or music videos or public speeches on the internet. And so I created these works as kind of homage to that experience. So basically these graphics have different references and different cultural figures placed within them. And it's kind of a personal study or a personal souvenir for my experience of learning more about Black culture in the year of 2020 in America. Another one of the works that I placed in my review show for Kent State were my couple's works, and I kind of changed their titles recently to call them Where You Come From. And these works are using a similar format to the Souvenirs from America, where there's vinyl graphics placed alongside a frame drawing. But these works are a bit different, that they're actually in conversation with vintage tourist pamphlets from Grand Cayman, from hotels in the 1960s. So it's basically a conversation between the hand drawings and the tourist pamphlets, and referencing the graphics and the advertisement language used within those pamphlets. And that sort of idea of playing with tourist advertisement graphics has led into my new thesis research. So now I'm really starting to think about formats. So whether it's advertising formats, posters, souvenirs, et cetera, in relationship to tropical tropes and identifiers of the Caribbean picturesque, and really digging into that and playing with that idea. And so I've been making a lot of these mixed media installations that incorporate certain things that are often associated with the Caribbean picturesque, whether it's aesthetics that have tropical flora or tropical birds or seashells. And I really like that idea too of using certain items within the installation, so that you have, for example, with the seashells, you have the materials which are strange alongside graphics of those things and how they kind of become loaded. And you're changing the actual material to become a loaded graphic that speaks to the Caribbean picturesque. So having those two beside each other. And I'm also creating smaller souvenir sculptures that are using a lot of the same materials that are in the larger installations. Colored feathers and seashells as well. And also placing them alongside the handmade again. So I'm bringing back in plaster and ceramics that I'm hand making. And then another thing that's being incorporated with some new souvenir works are that they're found objects, and they're using lots of figurines And depending on the timestamp for the figurines, they're quite loaded objects. So I'm also enjoying the idea of playing with these old loaded souvenirs and kind of recurating them within my own methods and changing their original purpose and allowing them to have a conversation with the audience as the audience comes to approach them. And that's all I'll share for today. And those are my contact details below. And as I mentioned earlier, my contact details will also be on the SculptureX website. So thank you all for listening and for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon, for your presentation. We have a few minutes here for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for Simon, please type them in the Q&A.
Melanie, should I stop sharing this?
Yeah, you can stop.
Okay, go back to the main area.
And also, if you have, questions that you think of later, again, you can contact Simon directly. You can also type it later and we can address the question at the end.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Cool. Simon, could you talk about like role of color in your work, especially like going from lots of color to then these kind of drawings that were very black and white to now returning to like really kind of this like mass maximalist color use?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth with the role of color in the work and whether it should have specific references or whether it's more for pumping a certain aesthetic. So I think with some of the works, when they go a bit monochrome, it's because I'm kind of moving away from some of the issues that color has when it comes to referencing Caribbean culture and just focusing on the content or the graphics. So with some of the works I did last year with the review, it was kind of intentionally doing that and then only using color as a sort of indicator and an accent for certain content. So like with the Where You Come From works, I would only highlight the text in a sort of tangerine orange to make it stand out on top of the monochrome drawings. And I'm going to flip around now that I'm doing more of the advertisement strategies because color plays such a big role in tropical advertisement. So really thinking about certain colors that are always associated with the Caribbean, certain types of green, certain types of orange and yellows and reds and blues. So I think, yeah, it's definitely about whether I'm withdrawing or pumping into an aesthetic that has a reference to Caribbean advertisement. That's when I use color.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Simon. We've got one question and then other questions we can address at the end or they can contact you directly. Do you consider your work to be a critique of forms of imperial control?
Yes. Yeah, I think ideas of post-colonial structures and post-colonial theory are definitely things that I gravitate around. But how it's critiqued, I think the degree of weight of its critique is something that I continue to think about. So I don't really want to do something that's just making these sort of advertisement graphics from the past seem very imperial. I think I'm also interested in what worked about them and also what was adapted, because there's certain things that were done within, vintage advertisements in the 60s and 70s that were very much adapted by local populations, and now it's being like regenerated or recycled, but being controlled by the local population for its own purpose. And nowadays, especially with COVID and all these different Caribbean nations having to rethink what role tourism plays in their economies and in their social settings, I think that's a good thing to think about what worked and what didn't, and not being afraid to recycle certain things, even though they were problematic from the past.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Simon, for your answer. And now we can move on to our next presenter, Shori Sim. So Shori, go ahead.
Lovely, great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And then I'll start from you're getting a little sneak peek. I'm going to start from the beginning. Okay, so hello, my name is Shori Sims. I am a undergraduate junior at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm majoring in fine arts with a minor in Africana Studies. And today we're just going to be talking about my work using a couple of pieces that I feel like are indicative of where I was and where I'm going chronologically. So this is the first piece we're going to talk about. It's a bust that I constructed. It's actually made from plaster, molding plastic, and it's entitled Sister Rabbit. This was the first sculpture that, or no, well, it wasn't the first, but it was the first sculpture. It was during my first year of college. Um, and really what I'm thinking about or like exploring here is the idea of a tar baby. And the tar baby kind of first appeared in Brer Rabbit stories, which were told by enslaved African Americans to one another. And it is about a trickster character named Brer Rabbit who comes across one day a baby made out of tar and sticks and leaves in the road, and he touches it. And when he touches it, he becomes stuck to it. And the more he tries to escape, the more stuck he becomes. And this is kind of gone on to mean a situation that one can't get out of. And the more they try and get out of it, the more stuck they become. And I definitely found this is a work in progress image. I found this definitely pretty analogous one-to-one to the way that a lot of enslaved African women were forced to care for the white children of their masters, oftentimes at the expense of their own children. Um, and kind of, I was thinking about storytelling, whose stories are told, whose stories get to be told, and whose stories are really honored and memorialized. And that's a lot of my early work had a lot to do with research. Well, it's less to do with research, but really historicization, and it was more based in history, whereas now I'm tending to look more forwards and using less traditional kind of ways of making. This was originally sculpted out of water, clay, and then cast in plaster, which is like an age-old technique. But for this next piece I'm going to talk to you about, I was using methods like 3D modeling, 3D printing, and photogrammetry. This is marked for photogrammetry, and more or less photogrammetry is the practice of taking a bunch of pictures of a sculpture and then uploading those back into the computer to get out a OBJ file and then doing what you will with that. So for this sculpture, that's one thing that I did with my little test, my little smaller test or my maquette. And for this piece, this is a very recent piece, this is from last semester. And for this piece, I was really thinking about the role of women and the role of the female body in the post-internet space. I was thinking about all the various, I guess, roles that women are expected to play. Here's another image in progress. And for this, I really wanted to counteract the kind of sterility of 3D printing and 3D modeling by really getting my hands dirty and creating the pedestal by hand and coating the sculpture itself with a mixture of marble dust and paper mache. And I was also interested here in combining the 2D and the 3D, which I chose to do using light and projection. One thing about my work is that I've never really found 2D entirely satisfying on its own, but it's also hard to find 3D entirely satisfying on its own too. So really trying to combine those and do something new with them. This is another work in progress image. And this piece doesn't have a title next to it because these are all in progress images. It's still a work in progress. I've yet to title it. I'm considering titling it The Loneliest Starlet because I do feel like the woman on top of the sculpture with the pedestal is both like a figure meant to be approached with reverence, but putting myself in her position, it's also a very lonely, kind of solitary image. Um, but yeah, so like I said, I'm really interested in combining kind of the 2D and the 3D in my own personal way. You can see the light effects here, but then also this is some of my newer work, which is focusing around that same thing, combine the 2D and the 3D. But here I'm leaning more into the 2D. And I'm doing this by, utilizing very specific lighting conditions, um, things like glitter, rhinestones, pearls, anything that throws light in a way that's interesting, or even incorporating like the work that you see to the right, incorporating a quilted banner, that a quilt that was made with a combination of fabric from my own home and from my childhood, fabric from my then partner that my then partner had given me, that I thought had a very pretty kind of feminine mystique or feminine vibe, with the flowers and the tiny ditzy flowers, and then the butterflies. But yes, here's my information if you want to get in contact with me. My whole portfolio is on my website, Shori, just my name, my email, and I post a lot on my Instagram. So if you want to get in contact with me through Instagram, please check me out. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Shori. So let's see if you guys have questions for Shori, please post them in the Q&A. And we have a few minutes to answer those questions before we move on.
Can I ask a question again? uh, sure. Can you talk about the role of the pedestal in your work, especially thinking about the kind of like four-armed sculpture you did, and thinking about really intentionally making that pedestal?
Sure. So the role of the pedestal, the work really, like, there you can see the pedestal and then the two little mats, like heart-shaped mats in front of the work. And what I was really trying to do was create for the viewer, or create for the consumer of the artwork, a kind of environment that would encourage them to kneel. The pedestal is actually constructed with a forced perspective, where it's smaller at the top and kind of larger at the bottom. And that's part of the reason why I constructed it by hand, to be able to get that. And it's really to make the object seem larger and thereby seem more, I guess, deserving of reverence by comparison. I was thinking of the idea of the simulacral. Um, and I remember a professor of mine had mentioned this concept of, in these ancient Greek monuments, or like shrines to gods, they would be created with a kind of forced perspective as well, that would make them seem larger, kind of larger than life by comparison.
All right, thank you for your answer, Shori. We've got a few questions here in the Q&A for you. So the first one is, what is it that you find dissatisfying about 2D or 3D work on its own? How does that lead you to explore more of these multidimensional, multimedia approaches?
Sure. So for me, even the process of making like strictly 2D work or strictly 3D work, I find it kind of like lacking something. I feel as if it's lacking something. It doesn't allow me to enter into the work the way that I like to. And I don't feel like it allows the viewer to enter into the work as they like to. I like enter into the work as kind of a separate space as well. Which kind of leads me to, I guess, create work that I feel like is truer to the experience of life or the experience of being alive, which is this constant mixing and constant, making and remaking of the 2D and the 3D and the combination that kind of goes on.
Hmm. Yeah, okay. All right, so here's our next question. How do you see your work as a way of building community?
Sure. So as far as my own work and building community, I am beyond just like creating work. I work a lot of times with communities. I'm working with the school programs department at the Brooklyn Museum, working with supporting educators and supporting schools with their programming. I work within the community here in Pittsburgh a lot of the time. I really feel like art is, it's going to sound cheesy, but I feel like art is kind of a language that everybody understands, or that it's something that everybody can connect with. I feel like on a level that isn't so, you know, it's not like isn't so elitist. I mean, people can make art into an elitist thing, I feel like, but um when it comes to understanding art, that's something that everyone can do and that everyone really does. So I see it as like a great through line to connect with people.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Shori. There's one more question for you. So if you want to type your answer, you can, but we have to move on to Dennis. We can also answer it at the end if we have extra time. So go ahead, Dennis.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Dennis Doyle. I'm a first-year MFA in sculpture and post-studio practice at University of Colorado at Boulder, but I come to Colorado from Pittsburgh, where I grew up, as well as I did my BA in studio art and BS in chemistry. So my work is really interested in kind of integration of perspectives and how that helps us understand different phenomena. So through mixing of my background in chemistry and my identity as a queer person and a Catholic person, how these influence my perspective. And since coming to Colorado, I was been really thinking about sort of connections of bodies through a common molecular materiality. So kind of jumping in, I've been really interested in recipes and altar bread baking. So these very Catholic recipes of just water and wheat, this very pure, clean, dead thing that through transubstantiation turns from bread into a religious body. And so I was really interested in how do I move my body into bread, making my body substantial? And what does it mean to take up space as a queer body in a very religious tradition? And so having this sort of tension of space and bodies and living and dead. So I began stacking these breads till they reached my height, but eventually it collapsed in the corner of my studio when I was gone for a weekend. But I sort of left it there and started observing it and thinking about it, how this still was a body that was taking up space, a body that was beginning to take on a new kind of material energy. And something that literally started taking on new life. So the microbes from my skin, from the air, from the flour, started growing in between the stacks of flat bread. So this dead thing has returned to a substance of life through some sort of microbial transubstantiation. So since this work, I've been started thinking a lot about really intentionally inoculating these breads. So taking things like my sweat, my microbes, mixing it into the bread, and seeing how microbes can exist as an extension of bodies. So for me, baking this bread and stamping in words that feel affirmation of my body. I was really thinking a lot about Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic in this project. And so I started expanding this out into other communities and thinking about how others think about their body. So I've been developing a mail project where people can send back questionnaires and swabs of their skin that I can bake into bread and start to kind of create this collaborative bread making project. So I started from this, thinking about stripping bread and body back down to its core, its molecular essence. So I started mixing sourdough hooch with sweat and was staging these performances where I was talking to these Petri dishes and this very dramatic monologue asking where do bodies begin and end. And so I was really interested in this sort of chemical materiality. So I started collecting my own chemicals, my sweat, my microbes, my hair, my cologne, my shampoo, and bottling it up and putting it in a small vial to create a scent of myself. Then one day I was walking outside my apartment and there's this great little free table where people put little objects they don't want. And I picked up this pearl necklace, and when I put it around my neck, it smelled like the vanilla perfume of who used to own it. And so I was thinking about now this connection I had to this person. And so I extracted the scent, put it in a vial, and I had made a friend. So I continued to do this, and before long, I had developed a community. So I go out into the world, I collect objects that have some sort of relationship to scent and isolate them with a perfumer's mixture of mostly grain alcohol, and creating these sort of scents of strangers. So scent of a stranger who wears anti-aging cream, scent of a stranger who owns a Ralph Lauren bag, scent of a stranger who wears drugstore lipstick and Zara perfume. I'm really interested in these ways in which we begin to communicate non-verbally and how our bodies extend into space and have implications outside of just our own limited area. And so from this work, I've been thinking a lot more about where do we see chemical bodies, right? And so thinking about my background in chemistry and taking an atmospheric chemistry course this past fall, I've been considering pollution as this sort of floating human body that binds us through a molecular materiality that begins to float out and transcend time and space. So I was really interested in how do you define a body by pollution? And so you could think about how maybe certain levels of a pollutant might define something as urban or as rural, and how is that kind of a failed definition? And also kind of researching these blogs of people talking about scent and how they can remind us of a memory. So for this person, the scent became the memory of their mother from a pollutant. So I was really interested in sort of how do you make visible a chemical body? So just using things like my tailpipe and sort of birthday latex balloons, being able to capture pollutants from my car, things like nitrogen oxide, and sort of making visible this invisible thing we encounter every day. And so I've been playing a lot around with how chemical bodies can exist in tension with one another. So how an urban air pollutant from cars and volatile organic compounds from trees only separated by a thin party balloon that prevents their mixing of making a toxic ozone formation. And so these chemical bodies aren't localized. You know, they move from city to country. We have implications on the actions that we take. And they have drastic ecological impacts from everything that exists in between. And so my work is really kind of interested in this tension of what's living and what's non-living, what's human, what's non-human, and how we're all sort of bound by this molecular materiality. And so through an interdisciplinary multisensory practice, seeking to elucidate what invisible lines that bind us and investigate what implications these sort of chemical markers can have for things like identity, community, and ecology. Because for me, chemistry is this way of breaking down categories to rather point out what are common implications. So thank you very much. Feel free to reach out and contact me in any of these sorts of ways. And thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dennis. So if anyone has questions for Dennis, go ahead and type those in the Q&A.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I really have I guess looking at your work, I'd like to ask if you could talk more about the role of religion and the ephemeral in your work, because I'm noticing a lot of kind of these ideas, or like even with the butterflies. I mean, not the butterfly, the balloons, not the butterflies, my apologies.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think there was like a long period of time where I felt these sort of disparities in my work of like work that might be thinking about religion, work that might be thinking about queerness, work that might be thinking about art making or science. And I felt like I was trying to explain them, and it was hard to kind of describe what they all meant to me. but it's all about this kind of practice of seeing and noticing and sort of repetition. So my work thinks a lot about kind of labor and a repetitive practice, and whether that's something that I'm in the lab and I'm pipetting chemicals, that's that same repetitive labor that I feel if I were to be in a church kneeling, or if I were to be in the studio printing late at night. That these are sort of ways of looking and understanding and trying to sort of grapple with the world. And each of them kind of provides a different tool for me to use that.
All right, thank you, Dennis. So we've got this one question that was sent a little bit before your answer. I think your previous answer kind of touches on this really nicely, but if you want to give any additional comment, during your bread making project, were you more focused on the chemical study or the artistic visual interest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like first and foremost, I come to bread making as someone who just like grew up watching cooking shows when I was little. And so it started as this kind of like comforting thing that I was doing during COVID. And yeah, I think it was something that over time, like a lot of my work, I sort of do approach from this sort of experimental science perspective of testing and trying and seeing what happens. And so I just sort of started playing around with this as an experiment, and over time letting it sit, putting in different environments, letting it mold, playing around with shape, playing around with imagery. So I think it's often work that starts as this sort of experiment that then as I get more interested in it, might be something that starts to translate into something that might be considered more of like an artistic practice.
Okay, so we've got another question from Ben Cromash. Who do you send your mail questionnaires to?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a process I'm still kind of figuring out. I kind of had put on hold, but I'm interested in kind of focusing on queer communities in general, and sort of ways in which queer communities are taught to make bodies smaller. So how do you make a body take up space and make a body sort of say words that have that sort of power, really thinking about these kind of notions of like the erotic body is finding this power in this sort of tacit knowledge that we have within ourselves.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any more questions, that kind of is our 10 minutes for Dennis, but we have an extra 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to ask any questions for the whole group, you can go ahead and do that in the Q&A, or if you just want to discuss something, you can. We've got 10 minutes. I know that's super open, but just like any questions for anyone. Oh, we had
Can you hear me? Oh, I was just wondering, just for all the panelists, how everyone deals with like collaboration with other people. Because I know Dennis kind of spoke to that, but I was wondering about, because I think I went to this post-commodity, gave a lecture here, and they spoke to a lot of like collaboration, and they were like, yeah, after working together for so long, private studio practice felt really boring. So we kind of don't have as much as a private practice as much as just working together. So just wondering how everyone else, if someone wants to speak to that, because I think that's a big part of like how I work in my studio. I'm constantly talking to people. I'm texting my friends all the time. That's a huge part of how I create dialogue and like get advice and stuff. So.
Sure. Yeah, so personally, I'm not. Well, you know what? I kind of take that back, because I was gonna say I'm not great at collaboration, but what I'm not great at is group projects. But what I do really like is like, which is like, can't do that anymore because of COVID. That sucks, because it feels like it's when I made my best work. But like being surrounded by other people when creating work, and like even if it's not directly building from one another, but like us, like by osmosis, kind of absorbing the energy of the people around you, um, is how I feel like I do my best work. I don't do my best work alone, but
Yeah, if someone wants to also, someone else wants to comment on that, as well as this a question, how has your quarantine affected your artistic spaces? I feel like those two questions kind of go together, and your work and shows.
Oh, I'll speak to the collaboration one first. I've been back and forth on collaborations. I've done a few during my practice, and the first one I did was actually during a residency in Aruba with a great Cuban artist, Humberto Diaz, and that was one of the most difficult things I had done up until that point, because I was very fixed in my type of thinking of what is a finished project, and he had a very different idea of that. So working together, that was like a great exercise for me to start changing formats and changing my ideas of what finished work can look like. And I think that's kind of how collaborations have gone throughout my practice, that I don't always jump into them, but usually collaborations I have with other artists, like the project that Christian Chen did in Trinidad, the Posted project, they have a big impact on me like after the fact, when I'm starting to digest what I contributed to when I'm by myself again in the studio.
Does anyone else want to comment on either of those? Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I think kind of my answer answers both of those. I mean, I think like collaboration is really important to me, and I think doing a lot of sort of partnerships with like scientists or philosophers has been like really influential to my work, and working with like close friends and like doing collaborative projects. But I think like the shift to COVID has really sort of made me rethink those things, and but also seeing how these things worked in the past of like I had done projects in the past doing like voicemail exchanges with friends. And so I think kind of bringing that into this new space of like being intentional about connecting with people, which I think has been hard, but also I think has forced me in my studio practice to really connect to my materials more. And that, yeah, sometimes when it's like 10 p.m. and you're in the studio and it feels like there's no one else in that space, you know, maybe it's a little crazy that I start like talking to my artwork or like talking to this bread that's sitting in the corner of my studio, but really start to understand like the material energy that these things start to have, and really kind of focusing on like how you can kind of communicate through your practice and through your materials has been sort of kind of how it's influenced my work.
Yeah. We have some questions, like kind of general comments, I guess, to wrap up about, like from Lisa and Ronald about this kind of like emerging artists format, and thinking about, I guess, next in the fall, thinking about SX, because ideally this type of thing is in person, and yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about this format, or if it was like how the experience was for you, yeah, in the last few minutes we have here.
I like the Pecha Kucha format because it keeps me from rambling.
Yeah, doesn't it? I think me too. As a rambler, like as as a rambler, it is helpful in that way.
yeah, I agree. It's because I'm also a rambler. So it really helps. It also helps to like, just make sure that it doesn't run on for too long. And so make sure that the presentations are tight because you want to hit this, and this, but you only have so much time. So it really encourages you to like figure out exactly what you want to talk about.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad that was helpful for you guys, and yeah, I hope it was like a fun experience, and I just have a few things to say here in the end. Yeah, thank you to all of our presenters. You guys all like had amazing presentations, and it was really inspiring for me and probably a lot of the attendants to kind of hear about your work. Yeah, and yeah, okay. And then, so last thing, join us for our next session at 1 p.m. You can find the link on the SculptureX website. It's with 3 educators. And don't forget that our SculptureX Symposium will be face-to-face in Greensburg and in Pittsburgh on September 16th, 17th, and 18th of 2020. You can learn more about the SculptureX Symposium of 2020 at sculpturex.org. That's all I have.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Everybody.
So much. Had a great time. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, keep in touch.
Yes, absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.